Full disclosure, I don't care much for Ben and Jerry's ice cream. In my view, they put all these chunks of stuff in it because the actual ice cream isn't terribly good, so I don't even have to get into their politics. I just think they're lousy at making vanilla ice cream. On the political side, I do rather admire the way a wholly owned subsidiary of the Anglo-Dutch multinational Unilever gets to pass itself off as some Vermont hippie family farm operation. On the day same-sex marriage was legalized, I happened to be tootling down the motorway in Vermont, and they had a roadblock at which Ben and Jerry's were handing out celebratory tubs of their Chubby Hubby flavour ice cream, now renamed for Gay Marriage Day, Hubby Hubby. If you're wondering what's in Hubby Hubby ice cream, it's 2 bananas and twice as many nuts. That's just another free one for Ofcom. I'm giving it all away tonight. As I said, too many chunks of stuff and not enough ice cream. Anyway, Ben and Jerry's went on a tear over the weekend about the government's plans to ship asylum seekers to Rwanda at the very same time as the Prince of Wales and future head of the Commonwealth, who'll be off to Rwanda for the Commonwealth Conference any day now. The Prince dismissed his mother's government's policy as, quote, appalling. Ben and Jerry and Charles, even more bananas, even more nuts. It's a pleasure to welcome back Brendan O'Neill from Spiked. Brendan, it's very odd to see princes and multinational businesses now hailed as the voice of the people. Very strange.
Very strange indeed. It's like all the worst people you can imagine lining up against this policy, which is enough even to make someone like me, who's a bit sceptical of the Rwanda policy, want to almost support it. I mean, the way in which Ben and Jerry's keep poking their nose into British politics is completely surreal to me. What British politics has got to do with this capitalistic ice cream making machine is a mystery, I think, to most people. And the government should just tell them to bugger off, of course. When it comes to Prince Charles, I think it's a bit more serious. He obviously hasn't learned the lesson of his mother's reign, which is that you keep your opinions to yourself. And he looks like he's setting himself up to be a very interventionist king, sticking his nose into politics. Well, I'm sorry, but we fought a civil war 370 years ago to keep the monarchs out of politics. And if Charles wants to overthrow that constitutional order, there'll be a lot of trouble.
What strikes me about that, Brendan, which is weird, is that the government of Rwanda is all in favour of this policy. They think it's good. They think it's great for Rwanda. And I find it odd that the future head of the Commonwealth is prepared to not just stick it up the butt of the UK government, but of the Rwandan government, because that actually seems to me somewhat racially insensitive, or whatever you want to call it.
Well, there's this implication in a lot of the criticism of the Rwanda policy. There's this implication that Rwanda is just the most awful country on the planet. I mean, you have Charles and all these middle-class leftists who've been taken to the streets of London to protest. What they're basically saying is, how on earth could anyone think about sending people to Rwanda? What a terrible scenario. They're almost depicting Rwanda as a heart of darkness, this kind of terrible, regressive place where no one would want to go. And the other thing they're saying, of course, is that, shipping migrants halfway around the world is a bad idea. Well, I'm sorry, but these migrants have already travelled halfway around the world to get to the UK in the first place. So it doesn't seem to make that much difference as far as I can tell. The problem I think some of us face, I am not convinced that the Rwanda policy is right or that it's going to work. But we've really been put on the back foot by these lame criticisms, because we find ourselves being forced to defend the government, which was elected by 14 million people, against Prince Charles, the House of Lords, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and all these human rights lawyers who were elected by precisely nobody. So this is a question of democracy versus elitism, and that's why the government should prevail.
This is a point you've been making ever since the establishment started to try to scupper Brexit, that it's essentially a permanent establishment trying to make itself immune from the voice of the people, so that even if the people explicitly vote for something, as they did with Brexit, or even if they do it more obliquely through a general election, their views have to be disregarded. Do you think we're moving basically into an anti-democratic age where elites simply know what's best, and if we're stupid to vote against them, they just ignore it and trash it anyway?
I think that's a real danger. I think the battle over democracy is probably the most important battle of our time. Whether ordinary people have the right to determine how their nation should be governed, what the constitution should be, whether they should have links to oligarchies like the European Union, these are fundamental questions that impact on our lives, and I think ordinary people should make the final judgment on them. But what we have in the UK is this permanent establishment, these elites who have been getting their way for a very long time. And what really shocked them about the 2016 referendum is that for the first time in a long time, they didn't get their way. And instead, the plebs and the gammon and the people they despise got their way instead. And they've never got over that. They have been having a hissy fit for 6 straight years. So I think what we're going to see from these kinds of people is more potshots at democratically drawn up legislation, more potshots at ordinary people for supposedly voting the wrong way. And they're going to try and accrue as much power for themselves against what they see as the regressive ordinary plebs out there. And I think standing up to that is incredibly important.
What's the problem with standing up to it, though, Brendan, is that, you know, half the population, give or take, seems perfectly comfortable to mortgage their rights to so-called experts. So that we've just lived, it started with the climate thing. Oh, unless you're a climatologist, you really shouldn't comment on the climate change. And then we had, unless you're a virologist, you shouldn't really comment on a lockdown and all that. And it seems to be expanding to more and more areas of life, this weird deference to rule by experts.
Yeah, the tyranny of expertise. You know, I love expertise when it comes to the question of someone fixing my Apple Watch, for example, or if I need an operation in a hospital. Give me as many experts as you can find. But when it comes to questions of how the country should be run, whether we should sign up to certain treaties, whether we should be in Brussels or out of Brussels, those are questions that all of us are capable of weighing up and making a judgment on. And that's what democracy means. It means trusting ordinary people, not as much as the elites, but more than the elites, because we recognize that ordinary people live in society in a way that many of these cut-off elites don't. And I think that the people who live on my street probably have a better understanding of this country and its needs than the people like Prince Charles or the Archbishop of Canterbury, who live in ermine luxury and never deigned to go outside. So that's what democracy means. And you're right, there are rather too many people who are willing to sacrifice their democratic rights to the guidance of experts. But I think a rebellion has been brewing for a long time. We saw it with the vote for Trump, the vote for Brexit, the uprising of the Canadian truckers, various movements in Europe. There is a movement of ordinary people against the elites, and I think the more of that, the better.
The funny thing is, on this Rwanda policy, I mean, even if they get the go-ahead, they're only going to really be sending maybe 100 guys a year to Rwanda. That's, you know, less than half the number of people who showed up on England's southern shore last night. So even the Rwanda policy itself acknowledges that actually doing anything about the problem on a large scale is now beyond a democratically elected government.
Well, this is one of my problems with the Rwanda policy. I just don't think it's going to work. It seems to me to be a stopgap measure dreamt up by the British and probably by the French as well to try and do something about the reckless, lawless crossings that are taking place from France to England. Or rather, they recognise that there's not much they can do, and so they come up with this policy instead, which, as you say, is not really going to solve the problem or even remove all the people who come to the United Kingdom. The thing is, what I think we have to remind people of is that it is not racist to want to control your borders. It is the right of every sovereign democratic nation to determine who can come to the country and who cannot, what goods can come to the country and what goods cannot. And the thing is that leftists used to understand this. They used to support the idea of national liberation and the idea that a country needs to be in control of its destiny in order to be a true democracy. But of course, they've abandoned that idea, and now they walk around saying borders equals death and other crazy slogans.
Yep.
So their abandonment of the idea of borders is really an abandonment of the idea of democracy and a turn against ordinary people. So defending our borders, I think, is the first step to restoring the democratic health of this country. So something has to be done about who's coming to this country and why.
Well said, Brendan O'Neill. You're absolutely right about that. And it is fantastic, actually, to see all these impeccable London lefties of good standing denouncing the frightful, ghastly idea of sending anyone to Rwanda. What a terrible place, when the whole theory of the Commonwealth is that all its member states are equal. And the UK and Rwanda are equally fine places, and this sort of neoliberal racist condescension, colonial condescension to Rwanda is actually spectacular to watch. Thank you very much, Brendan. It's always great to see you, and we appreciate your insights on this matter.